I guess the three of you guys are going to have to keep everybody else in line when we start getting off track during our regular meetings here. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight is our sampling programs. And you know, I'll describe the sampling programs, the kind of information that we collect through those sampling programs. And then also I'll give you some trends through time with the information that we've collected in those programs for the various fish species. Oops, better share my screen here. Okay. Can you guys all see that now?
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
So that's just a title slide. So to kind of give you a little bit of background on the sampling programs that we do, Mille Lake is part of the Large Lake program. This is a program that was started in 1983. And I think it was by a couple of real visionaries within the section of fisheries. And what they did was they basically said we should have some standardized sampling in the 10 largest walleye lakes in Minnesota. So each one of these lakes was assigned one individual, who's a large lake specialist. So the large lake specialist for Mille Lacs is Eric Jensen. For most of my career, I was the large lake specialist up on Lake of the Woods. And what the Large Lake program did is it provided an outline for the type of sampling that we should do. And the sampling was going to be annual. So you have to understand that in most lakes in Minnesota, you know, the smaller lakes, there could be at least a 5-year gap between sampling sessions. And so through annual sampling, we get a much better idea of what direction our populations are going in. The other part of our of the Large Lake program is that all these lakes we're going to have some frequent creel surveys. In the case of Mille Lacs and Red Lake right now, because there's some treaty issues involved in the harvest, we have annual summer and winter creel surveys on both of those lakes. Other lakes have somewhat less frequent creel surveys. Lake of the Woods used to be annual. But then with some budget cuts, you know, and we saw kind of what was going on with the fishery, you know, we felt that it could be on a 2 out of 4 year schedule. But most of the lakes are actually on a 2 year out of 6 year schedule for creel surveys. And so that just kind of relates to the importance of the lake and how much pressure there can be on these lakes and how much impact to those fish populations that pressure can have. So we're not going to talk about creel surveys today. That's going to be the topic next week. So anyways, by doing this more frequent sampling, we could start comparing trends both within the lake. So in other words, what's going on in Mille Lacs, we can watch how populations are developing on Mille Lacs Lake, but we can also compare that between lakes. So for instance, if we see that, you know, fisheries or fish populations are trending in the same direction on a couple of different lakes, you know, we can identify that as maybe something that's more of a broad scale impact to what's going on with the fish with our fish populations, and typically that's going to be weather patterns. And then finally, one of the really nice features of the Large Lake program is that we were really encouraged to tune our sampling to each individual lake, and so. Like with Mille Lacs Lake, for instance, you know, the most important fish species out there is going to be walleye, and that's pretty much the most important fish species on all of these lakes. But second, and you know, and third most important on Mille Lacs are going to be smallmouth bass and muskies, and also to some degree northern pike. So we've got special sampling that we've got set up, not so much for muskies, but certainly for smallmouth and northerns. So we've got our sampling programs kind of broken up into 2 broad categories. We do annual sampling, and some of these are pretty new. So annually, what we would like to do, you know, unless there's some reason that we can't, you know, and weather is frequently a reason, or sometimes we can't do an annual sampling on one of these aspects of our sampling simply because we run out of time or we've got some other commitments. So we added northern pike size distribution and smallmouth bass size distribution sampling in 2019. We've been sampling the zooplankton community since 2005, and I think I presented some of those data in our productivity talk. Water quality and chemistry has been ongoing since 2002. But one of the issues that we've had with the water quality and chemistry one is when this was initiated, they were sampling in some weird spots. So they were sampling very close to shore and inside some harbors. And that wasn't really giving us a good idea of what was going on in the lake in general. And so what we've got for water quality and water chemistry data really goes back only to about 2007. We have had a summer forage assessment just since this last year. The goal with our summer forage assessment, so we're looking at small fish species, the type of stuff that walleye like to eat. So that's really focused on young of the year perch. So in other words, perch that were hatched in the year that we're sampling them, as well as 1-year-old perch, so in the previous year. And the idea behind that program, as well as the fall forage assessment programs, is to give us an idea of how the abundance of forage is impacting our walleye catch rates, and also some of the other metrics that we measure in our walleye population. So for instance, growth or maturity is all basically related to forage abundance. In other words, how much there is for these guys to eat. In years where they have a lot to eat, they mature at an earlier age and they grow better, as opposed to years when there's kind of a forage shortage. The most important program that I think we have is our fall gillnet Krill Survey, and that's been more or less standardized. And I'll get into that a little bit why I said more or less. It's been more or less standardized since 1983. And so we've got a really nice long data series since 1983, and that's really an important one. Because we have had this data series since before the lake productivity really changed. So we can see what we used to have relative to what it is now. And then finally, we've been doing Creel surveys annually since 1983 as well. But like I said, I'm going to be getting into that type of the information around Creel surveys next week. So getting into the, excuse me, actual sampling programs that we've got right now. I'm going to go through these in chronological order. So in other words, based on the order that we start doing these things in the spring. So northern pike are the very first things that run to spawn, and that gives us an opportunity to sample these things on their spawning run without having to look all over the lake. We've got some very discrete sites that these things spawn in, and so we have the opportunity to sample them. And the other thing that's really nice is we've got some metrics set up in our lake management plan on what we would like to see in the size structure of our pike. And so it's obviously now we're measuring the adults, and so these are going to be the biggest fish in our population. And that's going to give us an idea of what kind of size structure we've got, because northern pike, what people really like about our pike population is the quality that we've got. And so with the type of gear that we're using, it's not very size selective at all. It's called a trap net. You can see the picture there in the lower left. And so what happens is we set these things into an area that the fish are going to spawn. They get into these nets and they can't figure out how to get out. And so we check these things once a day. We get a length on our fish, we get a sex on our fish, and then we let them go unharmed. It's really important to note that this type of sampling does not monitor the abundance of our fish. So, I mean, we might catch an awful lot of fish one year relative to another year, but what really controls how many fish that we're catching isn't so much their abundance in the lake, but rather weather patterns and how many fish are running at any one time during the spawning run. So in other words, in years where the spawning run is delayed, what tends to happen is it gets very compressed and all the fish spawn at the same time. In a year like last year, where we had a very, very early spring, the spawning run was really protracted. And so we were out there, we're only catching maybe a dozen to 2 dozen fish a day. And so that would give us a really low catch rate, even, and also a lot of effort had to go into catching enough fish to give us a meaningful size distribution. So I've got that picture there in the right, just to kind of show you two things. First of all, that we do have some quality fish out there. And secondly, that I do get out in the field every now and then. I'm just not just a desk jockey. So this is a relatively new survey for us. It was done intermittently in the past. Most recently, I think in 2014, but we started picking it up again in 2019. We had an assessment that year, and then last year with COVID, in 2020 rather, and with the restrictions that we had on us with COVID, we didn't get any kind of sampling done that year at all. And so this year was more or less the second year of our sampling. And I want to show you a couple things. This chart is actually pretty interesting because it shows two things. The first is that the blue bars are males, and you can see that very few males get longer than like about 700 and up to about 750 millimeters they grow. Each one of these intervals down there is a 50 millimeter length interval, so you can think of that as about 2 inches. 700 to 750 millimeters, so that 700 millimeter interval there, that represents 28 to 30 inch long fish. And so you can see that there's very few males that actually get to be longer than 30 inches on Mille Lacs Lake. The vast majority of the fish that get truly large on the lake are the females. And so if you look at that 750 millimeter bar, that's where we've got our maximum size for being allowed to harvest fish. So you can't harvest anything longer than 30 inches, which equates to 750 millimeters here. And so what you can see here is that the fish that have the opportunity to get truly large, which are the females, are fully protected once they get to that size. And so our management goals for the northern pike population is what we would like to see is about 30% of that spring sample of females be longer than 30 inches, 10% be longer than 35 inches, and we would like to see a few fish that are longer than 40 inches, and we call that like 1%. 40 inches on this chart is right around 1,000 millimeters. You can see we didn't catch any fish longer than that last year, but in 2019 we certainly did catch some that were longer than 40 inches. The next thing we start to do then is the smallmouth bass. We monitor the size structure of those. Same kind of thing as with northern pike. It doesn't monitor the abundance of fish. It just monitors the size structure. And the gear that we use for monitoring smallmouths is called Electro Fishing. And so what we've got is we've got a very specialized boat that puts an electric current in the water. We go out there during the spawning season. When the fish are close to shore, we just slowly drive along the shore, and we stun them with electricity. And so once we've caught them, we simply take a length on them. Male and female smallmouth bass grow at about the same rate, and they're not as easy to sex as northern pike or walleye during the spawning run. And so we just get a length on these things. And so that's what I'll show you here. This is the size structure that we got in 2021. 500 millimeters here is 20 inches. And so that bar that's right above 20 inches, or 500 millimeters rather, that represents all the fish between 500 and 525 millimeters, so 20 to 21 inches. Last year, it seems like in 2020, there was a pretty good year class that came off in 2020. And so we got a fair number of small fish. Now, keep in mind, these things aren't old enough to spawn yet. And so what we were doing is we were just going to catch a few stragglers, and that's that 200 and 225 millimeter bar. So these are like 8 and 9 inch long fish. The management goal that we have for smallmouth bass is that we'd like to see 6% of our smallmouth bass population being longer than 20 inches. Something else that shows here is that we did not catch any bass that were like 21 inches or longer last year. And this next, okay, so this is going to show you probably why that is, and that's because those are some fairly rare fish. So this is the growth chart of smallmouth bass. And this wasn't collected during our smallmouth bass survey. Rather, this was collected during our fall gill net survey, because that's a time of the year where we use gill nets, and that does kill the fish. And when we have dead fish, what we have is the opportunity to take a structure out of their head, and I'll show you some pictures of that later. It's called the otolith, and that's how we age our fish. What we can see from this chart is that it takes about 9 years for these things to get up to about 20 inches long. And then they really don't grow after that, on average. I'm not saying that there are no fish that are longer than that. It's just the fish that are longer than 500 millimeters are abnormally large. So in other words, they grew faster than what is normal. Does anybody have any questions about any of this stuff so far? Or should have said, feel free to interrupt me at any time if you want. Okay, I'll move on. So with regard to our smallmouth bass regulation, it's a 17-inch maximum size. So 400 millimeters, if you look on the left side here, this axis, 400 millimeters is like 16 inches. So it takes them about 5 years to get to 16 inches long, and then by the time they're 6 years old, that's about 17 inches long. And so these fish are all vulnerable to harvest over here, but once they get older than like 7 years, then they're basically protected after that. And you can see that smallmouth bass can actually live to be, fairly old. And so they're protected for at least half of their normal lifespan.
Tom, it looks like Larry has his hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Larry.
And I'm just surprised that you said that 20 inches, it takes only 9 years. I had heard of the reading in various magazines and that it took 15 to 17 years to get 20 inches, but this is really surprising. It's only 9 years on Mille Lacs.
Yeah, that's going to vary. I think we've probably got a pretty good prey base for these things. They do, feed on crayfish and insects and things like that. And as I covered in our productivity talk, I think a lot of our prey base has gone from something that was supported by a planktonic. It went from being a planktonic-based prey base to a benthic-based prey base because of the way that zebra mussels operate. And so I think that Mille Lacs is probably just really good habitat for smallmouth bass right now.
Well, that's some good news.
Yeah, and the other thing is, depending on how people age these things, otoliths tend to be very accurate. And I've got a picture of an otolith later on, and you can kind of see that. Now, I didn't provide a picture of a scale, but most people tend to still age these things with scales. Just because it's non-lethal. But the problem is that scales are notoriously difficult to age, and you can add a lot of marks into a scale that really aren't there. Otoliths are, it's particular with bass, you either see a mark or you don't. There's not a lot of interpretation involved in those things.
Thank you.
Yep. Oops, I think oh no, okay. So anyways, then after smallmouth bass, what we do is we monitor zooplankton pretty much through the summer. We start in either late May or early June, kind of depending on the year. And all we do is what Eric is doing here. So Eric is the large lake guy. He's holding a plankton net. We just drop that down vertically and pull it straight up. And so what the picture is on the lower left, that's a variety of species of zooplankton. And where zooplankton function in the whole food web is they're the little beasts that convert algae, which is plant matter, into an animal into animal protein, and that really is what drives then all of our fish species. We don't have a lot of fish species here that eat plants. They're all basically eating animals. And so if you don't have these zooplankton in there in the proper abundance, what you really do is you're really limiting how many fish that you can ultimately have in your fish population. And so what this sampling does is it monitors the species mix as well as the abundance of the zooplankton within our lake. And can't recall if I showed this or not in our productivity one, but what you can see is we started doing our zooplankton sampling in 2006, and that was the year that we first detected zebra mussels were in the lake. And so this is our June sampling. So this is the overall biomass. So in other words, the number of grams of zooplankton that are out there, or I think micrograms, that are out there per liter of water. And in June that year, so some of this stuff is going to be impacted by weather conditions. But when you start to look at the trends, you can see that 2008 was apparently a high zooplankton year on Mille Lacs Lake, but then there was this downward trend, and it really bottomed out in 2014, 2015, 2016. Now it's slowly been coming up again. I didn't provide our zebra mussel sampling in here for comparison. But what happened is we first detected zebra mussels in 2006, and they kind of bounced along at a really low level until about 2010, 2011, and then they just exploded. And so the highest abundance of zebra mussels that we had was in 2012, and then it slowly came down now. And so right now, 2021 with the zebra mussel sampling that we did, we're at about somewhere between 1/2 and 1/3 of their peak abundance. And so that what you're seeing over here in 2017, 2018, 2019 may have been a response to declining zebra mussel numbers. But then again, you saw that in 2020, all of a sudden our zooplankton population went down again. I really don't have a good explanation for that. But there's some differences based on the month that we're sampling these things in. So in July, you can see that we had, over the same time span, we had some really high zooplankton abundance. But again, it started to crash just as zebra mussels were coming on. And this may be more indicative of what's going on with our zebra mussel population, because the zebra mussels really start to get very, very active as the water warms. They're not quite as active in June yet. But anyways, you can see that, 2006, 2007, 2008, we had really good zooplankton densities, and it's just started coming down. And then it stayed really low as the abundance of zebra mussels was high. And then in 2018, it jumped up a little bit for some reason, but 2019, 2020 went right back down. And then in August, let's see, I've got a little tab sticking over here. In August, can see pretty much the same kind of pattern, but 2017, 2019, kind of jumped up again. I think there's just some sampling variability there. But overall, it looks like our zooplankton population may be recovering a little bit from the lows that we saw when zebra mussels were very, very high. Oops.
Looks like Peter has a question, Tom.
Okay, go ahead, Peter.
Are you sampling the same areas month after month, Tom?
Yes. So we've got some very specific sites that we do.
Okay.
And there are 9 stations that we sample around the lake. We sample them every other week in July, or in June and July rather, and then once a month in August and September. So what could influence that a little bit is wind direction. So if you've got a lot of onshore winds and we happen to be sampling in one particular site, it could be driving some of those zooplankton to higher densities along a particular shoreline. And that's what could give us some of those high abundances some years. But just by the large number of sampling stations that we have, and they're all around the lake as well as kind of in the middle, we try to avoid some of those biases, simply by having a lot of sampling sites.
Do you find more, you find more of the zooplankton in shallower, the weedy areas than you do in the middle of the lake?
The weedy areas would be very difficult to sample, simply because the nets would get fouled with a bunch of vegetation. And so the sites that we have selected are all between like 25 and I think 32, 33 feet deep. Simply because that's where the majority of the lake is. And so that would give us a good idea of the trends in the abundance of those critters.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so our forage sampling, we've got fall forage sampling as well as summer forage sampling. The fall forage sampling we've been doing since 2010. And like I said earlier, what the goal of this sampling is to just get an idea of how abundant our forage species are out there. And primarily that's going to be yellow perch, but we also sample young of the year tullibees, as well as young of the year walleye, and then also spot-tail shiners throughout their whole life, just because they don't get very large. So the gear that we use is very, very fine mesh gill nets for this thing, for these surveys. The fall sampling, we do, let's see, there's 25 stations that we sample in the fall, and we do those once. The summer forage sampling is we've got 9 stations, but we would repeat that when we can twice monthly, and starting in June. And so the idea is, like I said, is just to give us a better idea of what's going on with our forage out there. And big thing is that this would give us some insight into summer and winter fish catch rates. What we've seen through time is that in years where forage are very abundant, walleye tend to be very hard to catch, as opposed to when forage is really scarce, and it's just like everybody's catching a walleye. The most notable times in recent history that that's happened is 2019. We just had an outstanding year of walleye fishing all summer long, well into August. And then 2012 was another year. Now 2012 was actually a very interesting year because we had a very low forage abundance in the summer, and then there was a big year class of perch that got kicked off. And perch tend to get large enough to be of interest to a walleye sometime in July. And if you look at the catch rate statistics for the summer of 2012, we just had lights out fishing in the early part of the year in May and June. And then as soon as those young of the year perch got to be, call it 1 to 2 inches long in July and into early August, the fishing just died. So there's it's some pretty interesting stuff going on there. So what that helps us with is when we're doing the modeling, we kind of get some idea of what kind of catch rates we can expect through the winter, and then possibly also going into the early part of the following summer. And so that gives us an idea of what kind of inputs that we should be using in our model, whether we can expect high catch rates or low catch rates. So that's the goal with the forage sampling. And let's see. So this happens to be the catch rates for our young of the year yellow perch, going back all the way to 2010. So this is just our fall forage sampling. I've only been doing the summer forage sampling for 1 year, so we don't really have anything to compare that to over any kind of a time series. What we see in this case is for the young of year perch that they tend to be most abundant in our shallow nets, which is our 10-foot nets, and then as you go deeper, they become less and less abundant. So even though so this gives us something to interpret here, because even though we can have some very, very high catch rates in some of those shallow nets, we have to recognize that that's probably that particular range of depths that I think that 10-foot net represents is only about 7% of the lake surface area, whereas the 30-foot nets I think are like 75% of the lake surface area. And so when you weight those catches by the lake surface area, we get maybe a little bit of a different picture. And what's really cool here is that we see that in 2013, we had very high abundance of age 0 yellow perch. In 2017, we had a relatively high abundance of age 0 yellow perch. Both of those were ended up being strong year classes of walleye. What that suggests is a couple of things. Is first of all, those small walleye, those young of the year walleye had enough to eat. And so they probably grew relatively fast those years, and they were able to make it through the winter. The other thing that happened is that those age 0 yellow perch would buffer any kind of predation on walleye just because of their abundance. So just like with fishing, if you've got a lot of age 0 walleye out there, the larger walleye that could potentially be preying on the smaller walleye would probably be satiated just on perch rather than starting to focus on small walleye. And so that may give the small walleye an opportunity to actually form a year class. We don't know exactly what's going on yet in 2020. 2020 looked like it had a fairly high abundance of age 0 yellow perch. And so I guess at this point, I'm cautiously optimistic that the 2020 year class will be a decent one. And that is somewhat borne out by some of the numbers that we were looking at from our winter Creel survey, where anglers were reporting, pretty decent numbers of 10 and 12-inch walleye. So we'll have to see how that plays out. We should know by next fall whether those things actually formed a decent year class or not. And our fall gillnet survey. So the primary focus of our fall gillnet survey is on walleye, but we also sample and track yellow perch, cisco, so tullibees, northern pike, and to some degree smallmouth bass. Northern pike and smallmouth bass they're not particularly vulnerable to gillnets. Gillnets tend to be very size selective, and that's based on the size and shape of fish. Walleye is an ideal fish to gillnet, as are perch and cisco. Northerns and smallmouth bass are less so just because of their shape. So this map of Mille Lake here shows where we've got our nets set. And what you can see here is that pretty much the whole lake is being surveyed. The caveat here is that these offshore nets have only been sampled. The number of nets that we see here in the offshore areas have only been sampled since 2002, and that's largely a reflection of when we could actually find offshore nets again. You'd be amazed at how difficult it can be to find a gill net in a lake like this. And so once we had better navigation technology, we were able to set some of those offshore nets. Additionally, we had a review of the survey methods that were done in just prior to 2002, and the folks that reviewed that our methods suggested moving into the offshore areas as well as the nearshore areas. So that survey has evolved through time.
Looks like Larry has his hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Larry.
Tom, these nearshore nets, is that 10 foot and under? What kind of depth range do you have with those?
Those nearshore nets are, I don't think there's anything less than 6 feet, and then it goes out to about 20, maybe a little bit deeper than 20. The offshore nets are primarily in that 30 or so foot range, unless they happen to be right on top of a hump.
You basically put those nets in the same location each year then?
Yes. So they go in exactly the same locations. We've got some very precise spots set up with our gill net, with our GPS, and so on a lake like on a year like last year, where the lake was down like a foot or so, those nets may have been set in they were set in slightly shallower water than what is normal.
And do you keep track of the data so you know what a particular net year after year catches?
Yes.
Can you break it down like that?
Yep. Eric keeps track of all that stuff, and he's actually got the catch rates of every single net, as far back in time as we've been fishing these things, and definitely back to 83. I don't know if he was able to separate it out, prior to 83 or not, but all the way back to 83, we've got a trend for each individual net.
Are these nets all basically the same size mesh-wise?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I'm sorry I missed that. So in Minnesota, we've got nets that we call them standard experimental gill nets. And what they are is they're 200-foot long nets, and they're 250 foot long. They're comprised of 5 different mesh sizes of 50 with each mesh size being a panel 50 feet long. So gill nets tend to be very, very size selective. And the idea behind fishing a wide range of mesh sizes is that you want to catch as broad a size range of fish that you can, so that gives you a good representation of the size distribution of all the fish in your fish population.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Yep. The other thing that we do standardize is what time of the year that we set these things. And so we set them in September. But as we all know, weather can be very different from, one September to the next. And so we try to eliminate a temperature variable by not setting nets until the temperature goes below 66 degrees. So once we start setting nets, then we just fish them. So by fishing them the same place, the same time, at the same temperature every year, we try to eliminate as many of those types of variables as possible.
I know a lot. Last year, with it being pretty warm into the fall, the fish, from my fishing experience, didn't seem to move in shallow as early as what they would normally. And that's a concern, is that with the sampling nets out there, then the fish still hadn't moved into the shallow area yet at the time. Yeah,
and that's actually a pretty good observation, because our shallow nets really underperformed last year. And I've got that in one of our slides coming up, and I'll show you that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So this is gill netting. You know, we go out there and we set a bunch of nets, then we bring them back to the shop, and then we have to pick all the fish out of the nets. And so the things that we're measuring are, first of all, abundance. And you know, overall abundance is kind of interesting, but what's probably more interesting is the abundance by age group. So in other words, how many 1-year-olds, how many 2-year-olds do we have, how many 3-year-olds, and that gives us an idea of how year class strength changes through time. And when I say strength, it's a year class is simply all the fish that were hatched in a particular year. And what we have found is that fish like walleye, and this is, you know, goes across all of the whole walleye range. So walleye don't produce the same number of fish every year. It's highly variable. And the biggest variable that drives that is weather. So what we have is we've got strong year classes when we have a lot of fish produced in a particular year, and weak year classes when we have relatively few produced. We also keep our eye on growth, on age of maturity. Age of maturity gives us as well as growth. Both of those, and as well as condition factors. So condition factors, just how fat these things are in a particular year. So all of those give us an idea of how abundant the walleye population is relative to forage species. And what we found is that fish are kind of interesting. They're not like mammals, so they don't grow the same amount every year. You know, mammals basically have to eat almost constantly, whereas fish can go through very, very long periods of starvation, and all they basically do is they don't grow, or they don't reproduce, they don't produce eggs, and they just get skinny. So it would take an awful lot in order to starve a fish to death. You know, they're still going to be there, but they're just not going to perform very well. They're going to look bad. And so what does growth, age of maturity, and condition factor all give us an idea of is how abundant is our walleye population relative to our forage species. And that could be that ratio of prey items to predators gives us some ideas of maybe is our predator population really high right now, or is it our forage species are really low? And you know, there's kind of a dynamic between those. But in any case, that gives us an idea of what's going on with the way that we're managing our fish. And then all of the information that we collect, well, all of the information, the age distribution and the abundance of these things is really important. Those are all really important inputs into our catch at age model. And so the catch at age model is really the kind of our gold standard, if you will, of how many fish are out there in the lake. And I'll show how our gill net catches relate to that catch at age model. So this is what we're doing when we're sampling. You can see that these pictures were taken over the last couple of years because our guys are all wearing masks. We get a length. We open the fish up. We see what sex they are and whether they're mature or not. In other words, are they going to spawn the following year? Everything goes right into the computer. And if you recall, I talked about otoliths and the aging structure that we use when we age some of our fish. Otoliths are located in the head. So right here, we use a hacksaw. We saw down into the head. We crack the head open, and if you look really closely, you can see there's an otolith in the tweezers right here. And the way we age these things is we crack them in half, and they're kind of like an onion. If you think about slicing an onion right down the middle, and you can see the different layers in there, that's more or less what an otolith looks like. And so this photograph right here shows an otolith, and so this is one growth ring here. Let's see, this is one growth ring, 2 growth rings, and out here is the third one. You can see it kind of follow it out over there. Let's see, I've got a little gadget over here. You can see, so this is a 3-year-old walleye. It's got age 1, age 2, and age 3. And next spring, it's going to be age 4. It's going to lay down these dark bands get laid down in the winter. And so Larry asked, about our shallow nets. How did they perform this past year? And what you can see is that our nets, our offshore nets and our inshore nets more or less track the same. You know, they're not identical, but typically when you get a spike in the inshore nets, you're also getting that spike in the offshore nets. Might be different magnitudes, but basically they're tracking the same. Well, this past year was really different. So you could see that our inshore nets, this black line, was all of a sudden it went way down, whereas our offshore nets, you know, it went way down from the previous year, whereas our offshore nets stayed more or less stable from the previous year. And so that's why we do these kinds of things annually, because we understand that every now and then you're just going to get some goofy netting here. And unfortunately, that seems to be what happened last fall. But we won't really know for certain that that was the case until this coming fall. And so I expect that those near shore nets are going to bounce right back up again. We look at the size distribution of our fish. So this gray zone here, this dark gray zone, that represents the median of all the size distributions that we've collected between 2002 and 2013. And so that's kind of our standard to compare it to. So that's after the lake cleared up and our productivity went down, probably because of reduced phosphorus inputs. But it's only takes into account like 1 or 2 years of when zebra mussel abundance was super high. And you can see here is that, you know, the abundance of these small fish is kind of low relative to the long-term average, but then we had that good year class in 2017 and another strong year class in 2013. And so the abundance of those particular fish is far higher than what the long-term median or average is. And those 2013s and the 2017s are basically all in this zone right now. So from 16 inches on up to about 21 inches is the size range of fish from that 2017 and 2013 year class right now. The age distributions, they vary a little bit by depth. Typically what we'll see is maybe a few or percentage-wise, maybe there's a few older, larger fish on our offshore nets than our nearshore nets. But the same thing, you can see that they vary more or less together. This is a figure, I believe I showed this in the productivity talk as well. This is like the history of year class strengths. So the higher the bar, the stronger the year class, the more fish that were produced in a particular year. The lower the bar, the worse the year class was. And if we look at these averages, so I've got the average or median year class strength from 1976 to 1995 in there. 1995, if you recall, that's when the lake cleared up and it was starting to get obvious that productivity was going down. And what you can see is that there was a little step down in the median year class strength from 1995 or 1996 through 2006 relative to that earlier period. And then once zebra mussels came into the lake, we could see that there was a big step down. And so, I mean, that kind of gives you an idea of how the walleye population is responding to changes in productivity, and then also in the most recent time period, how the walleye population is responding to the invasion of the lake by zebra mussels. This is how our walleye are growing. I think I just took this from the most recent year of data. You can see the red line here is the females. The blue line is males. Obviously, the females are getting much larger than males. And you can see about how fast they're growing. So if you look at the 7-year-old fish, they're up, you know, the average male is a little bit less than 20 inches long. The 7-year-old fish, the average female is a little bit longer than 20 inches. And you can see that just keeps getting wider and wider. Where they really start to diverge is right around the time that males are becoming mature. Once they're putting more of their energy that they're taking into producing sperm, they're just producing less into growth. Females, they'll mature a couple, 3 years after the males do, and so they've got a bit of an advantage there. They continue to grow past them a little bit. So all the really big fish that you're seeing out in the lake, though, by and large, those are going to be females. It's very rare to get a male that's longer than about 22 inches. So if you look at growth through time, what we can see is since about right around 2015, all of a sudden there's this trend that our growth rates are slowing down. So what's going on here is that these are different ages of fish. These are the age zeros, 1s, 2s, 3s, all the way up to age 7. And what we can see is that they're just not getting as long. Ever since 2015 came along, all of a sudden you see this downward trend in growth rates for all those different ages. The only one that isn't really impacted by that is our age zeros. And this gets back to how gill nets work. They're very size selective. And so the age zeros, or the young of the year walleye, they just don't grow into that gill net, into that smallest mesh in our gill net very efficiently. And so the only fish of that age group that we're catching are the ones that are the longest. And so we're not really sampling them very efficiently until they're about a little over 6 inches long. And so they don't have the ability to get that much longer than 6 inches during their first summer of life. And so that's why you're seeing basically a flat line there. This is just because you're not sampling a good wide size distribution of that particular age class. We're looking at maturity. This is a maturity schedule. So you can see that in this case, the males, they're just barely starting to mature as age 2s. But then they're almost 100% mature as age 3s. And so if you look at the age of 50% maturity, which is going to be right around here, we call that 2.4 years old. The females, they're basically don't start maturing until they're age 4. And then they're about 100% mature at about looks like about age 6 here. And so you can see that they're maturing about 2 years after the males. And if you plot these ages of maturity on a graph, there's not a huge trend here, but we do see that there's all of a sudden in 2016, the females matured at a relatively late age. And in 2015, that happened to males. And I don't know exactly what happened in those years. I know that the 2013 year class was really abundant, and we stopped producing a lot of young of the year perch somewhere around there. It was just prior to that, really. It could have been an impact of either a cold summer or a late spring. Could have been an impact of not much forage being available for these things, and so that slowed things down for them. But you can see there's really not a huge trend. There's some waves through time, but not an awful lot going on there. Condition factor. This is a really interesting one because this is a measure of how fat the fish are. And this relates directly to forage abundance. And I've got 2 different colored lines here. And I'm going to show you how the condition factor of different size groups of fish changed because these different size groups utilize or have the ability to utilize some different age classes of yellow perch. So these fish that are smaller than 14 inches, they're really dependent on those young of year perch. And so if you stop producing a lot of young of year perch, they just don't have the ability to get fat. Up until zebra mussels came into the lake, which is the black line, you can see that there really was no trend at all in condition factor. And as soon as zebra mussels came into the lake, condition factor has just been declining for these smaller perch. And that's going to be kind of the story for all these different size groups. Once we get into these 14 to 20 inch long fish, these guys have the ability to utilize older yellow perch as a food source. So age 1 perch become really important to these guys. But you can see that their condition has been declining ever since zebra mussels came into the lake as well. And then 20 inch fish, you can see maybe their abundance or their condition factor was going down a little bit through time. That could be related to declining abundance of tullibees in the lake. Tullibees tend to be really high quality forage item for large walleye, as well as other large predators like northern pike and muskies. And we really have seen a long-term decline in tullibees, and I think I've got a slide that shows that as well. And so anyways, tullibees have been declining. I think those larger fish have been getting skinnier through time. And then but ever since zebra mussels came in, the decline in their plumpness has been going way down as well. Smallmouths. So we've been tracking smallmouths for quite a while. But you can see until the very early 1990s, we really didn't catch any smallmouths in our net. You know, every now and then there might have been a year where we caught one. All of a sudden in the very early 90s, there was a little bump and then they went away again. So for a period of years, we hardly caught any smallmouths. And then right as the water cleared, so this is before zebra mussels even came on, but right as the water cleared, smallmouths do relatively well in clear water. Their population, their abundance started taking off. And they didn't take off right away in the offshore nets. And I think that's because they were still colonizing that nearshore habitat. And as that nearshore habitat started getting saturated, some of those smallmouths ended up moving offshore a little bit and started to colonize the offshore areas. But you can see that smallmouth abundance has been going up through time. Yellow perch abundance. I've got a couple of lines here. So the blue line is perch that are less than 7 inches long. We don't really sample very many perch that are smaller than about 4 inches in our fall gill nets. And so the reason I wanted to show these fish that were less than 7 inches long was because this is before anglers start to impact their abundance. We could see that through the mid to late 1990s, you know, we were producing a lot of age 1 perch. And then that also translated into older perch. So age 1s are primarily less than 7 inches long, but longer than 4 inches. And then once they get to be 8 inches long, those are going to be like 2-year-old perch and older. And those are the size perch that anglers are going to start to harvest. But what I really wanted to show here is that it's probably not angler harvest that's impacting the abundance of our large perch. It's the lack of production of our small perch. We're just not getting super strong year classes anymore, except for maybe this past year. And if you think back to the slide I showed on forage abundance, those young year perch, we had relatively abundant young of year perch produced back in 2020, and that has translated into the highest abundance of age 1 perch that we've seen since like 2009. And so I think there might be some improvements coming down the road in our perch population. And I think just talking to a couple of anglers, you know, they're seeing a lot of those small perch out there in the water, whether it's on cameras or also on their sonars. So hopefully we'll see some improvement in our catchable size perch coming down the road here in the next year or two. Northern pike. Back in the 1980s, you know, we probably had a pike population that was maybe about as abundant as it is right now. It bottomed out in the early 1990s, and then you saw a slow increase in abundance of northern pike, and then it declined. So this era here, there was a few strong year classes that were produced in this era, and I think that's what drove the abundance up. And we haven't had a super strong year class of pike for a while, and so their abundance has just been tracking down. And I'm not really seeing a huge trend in our northern pike population at all right now in terms of abundance. And here's what I was alluding to earlier with our tulipy abundance. What we can see is that in our nearshore nets, tulipy abundance has just been on this gradual downslide, and I think that's what's probably impacting the condition factor of those larger walleye. Every now and then we produce a good strong year class of tulipies. You know, we produce one back here somewhere probably. That's showing up in our offshore nets, as well as our nearshore nets here. Looks like about 2006, 2007, we produced a good year class of tulipies. Then we had another one in 2014 that was really strong. But tulipies, you know, by their nature, just don't have good year classes every year. They tend to be very periodic. And even in the best tulipy lakes, like Lake Superior, which they're very well adapted to, they have very infrequent year classes of tulipy, and I think that's what we're seeing here. But the important thing to note is that we've got this long-term decline in our tulipy population. You can see that in the last several years, we've hardly caught any tulipies in our nearshore nets at all. So that's an issue, and that's one of the reasons that we were looking at reducing our tule B limits for our sport fishery. So those are all the annual sampling programs that we've been doing. We also have some intermittent sampling programs. One of those is walleye population estimate. It's extremely rare to actually do sorry about that. Extremely rare to do a walleye population estimate on a lake as large as Mille because it tends to be extremely expensive to do. It's very time consuming. You know, you need a lot of people to do it. So currently we're doing this on a 5-year rotation. The last one was done in 2018, and so we're scheduled to have our next population estimate for walleye in 2023, so next summer. This population estimate is a really important input into the catch-at-age model that we use to estimate how many walleye are out there in the lake. Really what the catch-at-age model does is it fills in what's going on with our walleye population between population estimates, and the population estimate is really used to kind of, I don't know, I want to say anchor our that catch-at-age model, and that's primarily to make sure that that model isn't drifting for whatever reason. Next summer, we are also going to be doing a northern pike population estimate. That's not really on a schedule. That's done more on an as-needed basis. The last one was done in 2014, and so we've got one scheduled for 2023 in conjunction with our walleye population estimate. Then finally, we're not looking at doing the hooking mortality study on any kind of a schedule. The initial one was done in 2007, and there were some issues with that, and so it was repeated in 2016. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So our walleye population estimate is a mark recapture estimate. It's called a Peterson estimate. If you want to understand a little bit more about that, just Google a Peterson estimate, and you'll get your wiki page, you know, that discusses that in detail. But the goal of this of our population estimate is to estimate the number of walleye that are 14 inches and longer. It's called a modified Peterson estimate. And the formula is simply you multiply the number of walleye that we marked times the number of walleye that we examined for marks divided by the number of recaptures. So it's really just a ratio of marked to unmarked fish when we're doing our recapture estimate. So in 2018, we tagged 20,000 walleye in like 10 days. That was a lot of work, a lot of nights. Of those 20,000, we recaptured 154, and we had to examine 6,500 walleye to look at 154 of these things. And our population estimate was 730,000 based on that. If you actually do the math, it's not going to come up with 730,000. The reason for that is that we actually estimate the number of males and the number of females in our population, and we sum them to get that walleye population. The reason that we have to estimate the number of males and females is because that our sex ratios are skewed. They're different in the marked population relative to what we do a couple of weeks later when we're trying to recapture these things. And that's simply based on the way that walleye spawn. Male walleye come in and they spawn, and they're basically hanging out on the spawning grounds the whole time, waiting for the females to come in. Females only come in when they're ready to drop their eggs. And so they're not really vulnerable to being sampled by us. And so in our, when we're tagging these things, we're probably tagging, I don't know, maybe 85% males, whereas it's probably closer to 50% males and females in the recapture effort. And because of that, we just have to split our population estimates by sex. So how do our population estimates compare to our gill net catch rates and then also the catch-at-age model? So the that kind of orangey line is what the catch-at-age model is estimating the walleye population is. Those large red dots are what our population estimates actually say is out there in any particular year. And then what the black diamonds are is our gill net catch rates. And the really big take-home message here is that they all vary together. So when we see a declining trend like over here, We see a declining trend in the population estimates. We see a declining trend in our gill nets. And we see a declining trend in what the catch at age model is telling us. When it bounces up in our gill nets, comes back down. And then when it's kind of stable, you know, it was kind of stable through this period. All of a sudden we had this low period. We had low catches in our gill nets. The catch at age model said our population was low, and our population estimate said it was low. And then as that 2013 year class, which is like produced over here, it came along, our population, you know, the way that the catch at age model was predicting what was going on went up, because keep in mind, these are only fish that are longer than 14 inches, so it takes a few years to get there. The population of 14-inch plus fish was going up. The gill nets were showing it was going up, and that population estimate that we did in 2018 showed that our population was higher than it was over here. So their take-home message here is they're all trending together, and that's really important because that gives us a lot of confidence in you know, in what that catch at age model is actually showing us. Hooking mortality, excuse me. The original study was done in 2007. That was followed up in 2016. The estimates were modified after the 2016 study. One of the issues that we found in the 2007 study is that there was something in there that just didn't make sense, and that was that hooking mortality varied by the size of fish. And the reason it didn't make any sense to us was because it was opposite what we expected. We would have expected relatively high hooking mortality in small fish and large fish, and relatively low hooking mortality in kind of those medium-sized fish, just because of the way people fish, you know, and how much damage you could actually do to a fish, and how much of a fight the fish are putting on before they come to the boat. And it was actually the inverse of that. And so ultimately, though, that study was repeated in 2016, and that study found that there really wasn't any difference in the hooking mortality across a broad range of sizes. When you took out the size of fish that died from that original 2007 study, what we found is that hooking mortality rates were actually very similar between the 2020 and the 2007 and 2016 study. The big impact to hooking mortality is temperature, and by agreement with the tribes, we have to account for hooking mortality as part of the state fishery harvest. So I'll show you what how hooking mortality varies by temperature. You can see that at low temperatures, hooking mortality is almost non-existent, but then it goes way up. And so by the time you're hitting like 75 degrees, you know, we're probably looking at somewhere between 10 and 12% of the fish that are being released are dying due to hooking mortality. And then every now and then when the temperature really goes high, you know, you could be looking at up to 20% of the fish that are dying because of hooking mortality. We have temperature loggers out on the lake collecting temperatures throughout the whole summer. And our Krill Survey estimates are done, you know, in the summer, of course, is when we have our most hooking mortality. Our Creel Survey estimates are done every 2 weeks. And so what happens is every 2 weeks we go out there, we pick up our temperature logger, we download that into the computer, and we get what was the average temperature over that 2-week span. And that's the temperature that we apply to those released fish. From all those data that we've collected, you know, we know that July tends to be the warmest part of the summer. So that's this area here. So that sheds some light on why we choose to have a planned closure in that first part of July. That's one of the time periods that temperatures are high, so hooking mortality is high. And in that first half of July, we still have a fair bit of pressure on the lake, and fishing can actually be pretty decent yet at that time. So in order to avoid late season shutdowns, we, you know, and until now, you know, we've been looking at that 2-week closure in the first part of July. So this isn't really an assessment that we've done. This was kind of a one-off project. So the walleye population has gone down on Mille Lake, you know, since the early 90s, the 80s and the early 90s for a couple of different reasons. But because walleye fry stocking is something that's kind of a standard management technique across Minnesota, people have gotten used to expecting that when you dump a bunch of fry into a lake, that you're going to produce a walleye population. And, you know, it's frequently suggested to us that we just stock a bunch of fry in the lake, and we can make the walleye population recover by doing that. So we did you can actually do a fry population estimate by stocking a bunch of marked fry into the lake. And the way we mark these things is we use a chemical called oxytetracycline. It's kind of, it turns the water yellow. So each one of these jugs has a bunch of fry in it, and these guys are floating around in a bunch of oxytetracycline. And what that does is it marks the otolith on the fry. And so what we did is we stocked 10 million fry in each of 3 years. So we stocked 10 million in 2016, 2017, and then another 10 million in 2018. And this is Eric stocking some fry here. And then based on that, we're able to estimate how many fry are actually produced in the lake naturally. So first of all, to identify our stocked fry, what you do is we go out in the fall and we catch a bunch of young of the year walleye. And we do that either through our fall gill netting, or we do some electro fishing in the fall that I didn't cover, and also through our fall forage sampling. And we take the otoliths out of those, and you can shine a particular wavelength of light on them. And what you do then is you look at the otolith, and the fish that were marked with oxytetracycline, they fluoresce. So in other words, they glow. And that's this ring right here. So this is a fish that was marked. And it was marked at this point in its life. So this was the edge of the otolith when it was marked. And so now we can identify those fry, and then we just do a Peterson estimate, just like what we did with our regular population estimate. And that gives us how many fry were actually in the lake at the time that these things were stocked. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the abundance of fry, or the fry population per literal acre. And in Minnesota, we define literal acres as, I think it's that portion of the lake that's less than 12 feet deep. And so for perspective, when we're trying to establish walleye populations in the lakes that we're actually stocking to establish a walleye population, our target is to stock between 500 and 1,000 fry per literal acre. So Mille Lake naturally in 2016 produced 7,300 fry per literal acre. In 2017, it produced over 13,000 fry per literal acre. And in 2018, it produced almost 17,000 fry per literal acre. So think about that in terms of what we normally stock in our lakes in order to establish a walleye population. So we've got a bunch of literal acres. We got 33,000 literal acres. And so Mille Lake in 2018 naturally produced 553 million walleye fry. I was curious about that. Like, how does that compare to what the Minnesota DNR produces annually to stock all the other lakes in Minnesota that we stock? We produce like 400 to 450 million walleye fry as an agency to stock all of the other lakes in Minnesota. So what that means that in 2018, Mille Lake produced more walleye fry naturally than what was produced by the Minnesota DNR to stock all of the other lakes in the state. And so if you recall at our initial meeting when we were talking about whether fry stocking would work, or whether we're taking out too many adult females out of our population, I believe it was Brad that mentioned that Mille is not limited by fry production. It's limited by other things. And this is kind of the background to that particular statement. We produce a lot of fry in Mille Lake. My monologue is now over. So if any of you guys have any questions or want to talk about anything, wide open now.
Looks like Larry has his arm up.
Go ahead, Larry.
Tom, this fall forage assessment, do you get the results of that back soon enough to help you make the decision whether or not there'll be a fall harvest? Meaning
No.
okay.
that fall forage assessment, we're still trying to get our heads around exactly what that means. It seems like we can detect when young of the year perch are present at very high levels, but it seems like it's not super sensitive. And when they're present at moderate levels or low levels, there doesn't seem to be a lot of variability there, So that kind of, when they're present at very high levels, it seems like we can say, okay, it looks like the fishing is going to be a little slower this winter. And then that would also translate to relatively, slow fishing in May and June. Excuse me. But what really drives whether or not we allow fall harvest and fall fishing is how many fish were caught through the summer. So, and that kind of relates to what this fall forage is telling us. But we've already got the data through the Creel Survey as to how close we are to our quota. And that drives whether we're going to allow fall harvest or not.
And then I have one other question. In years like last year where the fall gill netting, the numbers were down in the nearshore nets. Is it a possibility of waiting longer, or even possibly doing a second one? Because as I understand correctly, it's these fall assessment, gill netting assessments, would basically you use to determine what the harvest will be, our population for the next year. So
yeah, so the fall assessment is a really important input into our catch at age model. Other things that go into the catch at age model are how many fish were actually harvested through the Creel Survey, how many fish were harvested through the tribal fishery, and then the most recent population estimates. And then there's other things that are in that. I'm not, I'm going to back up here a little bit. I'm not the person that does, that modeling. That's way beyond me. That's actually a very, very specialized skill. I know a little bit about the inputs, but one of the advantages to that model is that it doesn't rely exclusively on what our fall gill nets are showing in 1 year. And so the model, in essence, it kind of dampens what happens when you get a goofy year of netting. The other good example of that is 2018, when we had an unusually high number of fish coming into our fall gill net. So in other words, our catch rates were way higher than what was predicted, but our catch at age model stayed a little bit lower than that. What happened this year is with our nearshore gill nets kind of underperforming relative to what we expected, the catch at age model didn't suggest that our walleye population went down as much as what our fall gill netting showed. So if we had relied exclusively on fall gill netting, you're right, we probably would have been looking at, really having to cut down our harvest because all of a sudden we've been throwing up our hands in panic. But the catch at age model, what that's done is it's dampened the impact of any one particular year, just because of all the inputs that are going into this thing.
okay, thank you.
Yep. But one of the reasons that we are being more conservative, with our harvestable surplus this year is because we're not seeing a lot of small fish coming up. In other words, we don't have any strong year classes coming up based on that fall gill netting. Now, my impression is that the fall gill netting was low this year, and so that's going to have an impact on our view of what year classes are coming along. So hopefully that's going to turn around next year, and we should see some more strength into those year classes that are going to be coming up into that harvestable population, which is the fish that are 14 inches and longer.
Okay.
Anyone else? Don't be shy. There's a lot of information there, wasn't it?
Melissa has her hand up. Go ahead, Melissa.
So, Tom, did you find this year, to me personally, it seemed like the big fish that were caught were more in between 22 to 25. I didn't seem to find the 26 to 28s as much. You know, there was still, you know, a lot of the good smaller classes, you know, nice size fish, 14 and up as well. But I'm just not finding those big fish as much the last couple, 2, 3 years.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
to
Yeah.
figure out, you know, is there something going on to where the fish maybe aren't getting as big? Or I know that what we're catching, they are looking good and healthy, you know, of course, because they're feeding on them perch and everything, but just not as big. Or am I just unlucky?
No, our gill nets are showing that as well.
Okay.
So we're just not seeing those fish, particularly the ones that are larger than 25 inches.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things going on. You know, one is that, you know, it does look like our growth rates have slowed down. The other is that, you know, we've got that strong year class from 2013. And so that's really what's driving the most common size of fish that you're catching, which are up to like about 21 inches.
Mm-hmm.
There was 4 really, really weak year classes before that 2013 year class came along. And so there is truly, you know, kind of a low spot in the abundance, in the age structure. And of course, those are the fish that would be larger than those 2013s right now.
Okay.
So I think that's what's going on. But it's a combination of abundance as well as reduced growth rates.
Okay. Thank you. I was just wondering, yeah, if you were seeing that as well.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Hope it didn't scare anybody with all the information there.
Tom, slur dealer, when do you think we might see what the regulations for this year are going to be?
Supposedly tomorrow. Yeah, we've got a press release put out. I mean, pretty much tell you they're going to be very similar to what they were last year.
Okay. You know, and I guess one of the things that I see with the hooking mortality in your chart that you showed, the warmer months, you know, we typically use about 3/4 of our quota for hooking mortality.
Mhm.
And it looks like, unless there's some magic way of catching a fish without killing them during the warm weather, it looks like the only thing we got going is not to fish
Right.
during those warm weather months. And I just it's a shame to me to waste that much fish. And I wish we could do something that we can do better to lower those numbers.
Yeah, you know, I can see where you're going with this, you know, but I can tell you that managing fish is really a balance of the biology and what our user groups want.
Correct.
You know? And our user groups, by and large, are not super fond of closing fisheries, you know, in the middle of the summer.
Right. That's understandable, but that's a lot of pile of fish that are just going to waste. So I guess it just needs to be everyone know, if you want to fish during the summer months, this is the way it's going to be. We're going to use a majority of our quota is going to continue to go down the hole for
Yeah.
hook and mortality.
Yep. No, I completely understand that. Looks like Melissa has her hand up.
Yeah, as far as the hooking mortality goes, I think that kind of goes around a couple different things where, you know, July, 4th of July, it gets really busy up there. It's insane. Everybody's out on that water, and you have a lot of inexperienced anglers that they don't know how to slowly reel these fish out of the depths and not to let them swallow a hook.
Mhm.
So there's some uneducated people out there as well too. I'm all for closing it down for that hooking mortality. The water's just way too warm. It gets way too warm that time of the year, and I'd rather give them a breather and save our fishery personally.
Yeah, yeah, well, I appreciate that. You know, when we shut it down for the entire month of July, you know, that got to be pretty unpopular. But I mean, truthfully, for this 2-week closure, I know there's always individuals that don't like it, you know, but I really don't hear an awful lot about it. You know, it's not something that drives a lot of people crazy.
No, I either go to another lake nearby or somewhere else,
Mhm.
or